questions, can we maybe ask you to pause in the middle and just go through questions as they come, or would you prefer to take them all at the end?
No, I'm easy. I mean, since they're two distinct papers I'm presenting, it makes sense for us to maybe do the clarification questions through each presentation, and then we'll stop for maybe a few minutes after each of the two papers so that we can have more general discussions about them, because they're quite distinct from one another. Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay. And then towards the end, we like keep about 15 minutes for completely free open Q&A. So you can ask about anything that interests you beyond what was presented today as well. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think it's, as I was saying earlier, it's really lovely to see such an initiative being set up and run from here. I noticed you've had pretty illustrious group of speakers already, so I'm quite honored that you invited me as well. What I'm going to do today is talk about a couple of papers that I've been working on recently. They both relate to gender and education, but at very different points of the kind of human capital investment cycle, as you will see. So I'm going to present them in two separate chunks just because they are quite distinct from each other. But the common thread that runs through them is very much understanding different dimensions of gender bias. The first paper is called Preferences or Expectations, Understanding the Gender Gap in Major Choice. And I've written this with my colleague Aparajita Dasgupta, who's also at Ashoka University. And the motivation behind this paper was really thinking about how men and women decide what to study at university. And the reason we ask this question, of course, is because of the very well-known underrepresentation of women in some fields at university, particularly STEM fields, which includes economics and business, leading to substantial earnings gaps later in their careers, because these also happen to be the fields that are associated with higher earnings. So around the world in the last few years, women have closed the gap in college enrollment. So in the United States, they closed the gap several decades ago now. But even in India, the gap in college enrollment is pretty much zero now between men and women. But the enrollment into different majors remains highly gendered. So in the United States, for example, women are 2/3 as likely as men to study STEM. And in Indian schools, girls are about 20 percentage points less likely to study science or business than boys, right? Why is this important? Because we think this has significant financial effects, and we think this is a major contributor to the gender earnings gap. And the reason for that is there are high salaries associated with completing science or business majors. So in the United States, for example, the highest paid undergraduate major is electrical engineering. And so the wage gap between the highest paid major, electrical engineering, and the lowest paid major, which is a general education degree, is similar in size to the gap between the average return to going to college versus not going to college. So this is very high level of variation that exists across different majors. Unfortunately, we don't have great data from developing countries on the returns to different majors, but there is one study in India that's found that studying science in high school is associated with a 22% increase in incomes. So even in India, there seems to be a similar pattern of higher returns to STEM subjects, to studying STEM subjects. So with this in mind, we really want to ask, how do students decide what majors to study? In particular, how do men and women decide which majors to study? What is the relative importance of preferences for pecuniary versus non-pecuniary characteristics of majors? The reason we ask this, of course, is that if earnings isn't driving women into science, then clearly they may be valuing other aspects of those majors differently from men, non-pecuniary aspects, which is leading them to opt out of science and into other disciplines. And finally, what is the relative importance of gender differences in preferences, or how they value, how much they value different attributes of the major, against differences in beliefs about future outcomes in terms of explaining low enrollment of women into these different majors? And the reason we want to stress on this distinction between preferences and beliefs is that it has a really important implication for policies that are then designed to try to have a higher representation of women in subjects where they're currently underrepresented. So whether we think it's the preferences that are driving this or the beliefs that are driving this turns out to be quite important, as I will discuss in just a bit. So what do we do in this paper? The first thing we do is we collect subjective expectations data from undergraduate students who are in the process of selecting a major, I'll describe what that is to you in just a minute. And we use these data to estimate a model of major choice, right? When we estimate this model of major choice, we're able to back out preference parameters for each of these different attributes of majors and their jobs. And we can estimate the willingness to pay for different non-pecuniary attributes of majors and jobs. We then decompose the gender enrollment gap into differences that arise from expectations and differences in preferences. Okay, quick preview of our results. We find significant differences in preferences by gender. The willingness to pay for higher grades and higher course enjoyment is twice as high for women as it is for men, which is important because this is these are highly provide a mechanism for how women are selecting out of subjects like science and economics and into subjects like social sciences and the humanities. But as different as these preferences are by gender, compared to the United States, for example, a much higher share of gender differences in enrollment in our sample, 50 to 75%, can be explained by differences about beliefs in future outcomes. And in particular, in our sample, we see evidence of substantial errors by gender in the prediction of grades and in the prediction of post-college earnings. So that really sets up, I think, a case for a policy intervention that can then be used to shift these beliefs of men and women. And in doing so, maybe reduce at least some of the gender enrollment gap. And the reason I focus on this is preferences are typically hard to move, right? They come from kind of deep-rooted social norms and they can be quite tricky to shift. But in many ways, this is a lower hanging fruit if you are able to shift the distribution of beliefs about future outcomes. Okay, so almost all of the existing literature is drawn from undergraduate students in the United States. And so this, we think, is an important contribution of our paper. To our knowledge, it's the first paper that estimates such a model using data from a developing country, which is India. The reason we think this is important is that the extent to which preferences are driving gendered enrollment into majors, and even the extent to which there are misgendered perceptions of future beliefs, these are going to be influenced by the local cultural context and by the local or prevailing social norms that students are influenced by. So I think it's really important to be able to replicate these kinds of studies around the world. And the second thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that we distinguish between preferences and beliefs, which we think is very useful in terms of informing policy. Okay, so let me tell you very quickly about our data sample and I'll get to the results. So we surveyed 356 undergraduate students at a private university near Delhi. They're in the process of selecting one of several majors, which we group into 4 big categories, right? Science, economics, social sciences, and the humanities. This is a picture that shows us the share of students who rate a particular subject as their most preferred. And so you can see that the selection of subjects as most preferred or major choice is very, very gendered in this sample, right? Women are disproportionately selecting social sciences and the humanities as their most preferred major, whereas men are much more likely to pick science and economics as their most preferred major. And so of the students who are selecting science or economics, the majority are men, and similarly of the students selecting social science and humanities, the majority are women. From these students, we then elicit subjective expectations of college level outcomes and labor market outcomes that are conditional on a given major choice. So, sorry, is there a question or something? No. Okay. So we want to elicit subjective expectations of these college level outcomes and labor market outcomes that are conditional on major. So I'll give you an example of what these questions look like. So for example, we ask, what is your expected annual income immediately after graduating college if you major in science? And similarly, we repeat that for economics, social sciences, humanities. Or to look at another attribute, what is the probability that you will graduate with a GPA of 3.3 on 4, which is an above median score? What is the probability of your working in your preferred sector immediately after graduating college? And so the probability questions are answered on a scale of 0 to 100. And the continuous variables such as income are just, students just give their expected annual income at the point in their first job immediately after graduating college. So these data are really interesting. I'll just show you one example of what they look like. So this is the data on the distribution of beliefs about grades in economics and grades in the humanities. right? So these are CDFs. So this just tells us what share of men and women believe that they will get a particular grade B+ in economics and in the humanities. And you can see that there's a very, very stark difference between the upper panel and the lower panel, right? In the upper panel, you can see that at every point in the distribution, men are much more likely to believe that they will get a B+ in economics than women. But in the lower panel, you can see that women are much more likely to believe that they will get a B+ in the humanities compared to men. So it really seems to be that men and women are selecting into these different classes of majors, both in terms of grades. We see the same pattern being repeated for probability that they're going to work in the preferred sector, in terms of their earnings, and in terms of course enjoyment. We also see this repeated with science, where science and economics follow a very similar pattern, and humanities and the social sciences that follow a very similar pattern. Okay, the next thing we do is then we use these data, these subjective expectations data, to fit a major choice model, where a student is basically choosing one out of a choice of M different majors. And these majors give the student utility from different characteristics. So they're major related characteristics as well as job related characteristics that we consider in this model. And at the same time, we allow for the fact that individual characteristics will also mediate the utility that students get from different choices. What are the choices, or what are the characteristics that we look at? So major related characteristics, we include questions and data on love for the subject, expected grades, comparative ability at the subject. Job related characteristics, we consider expected wages, the probability of getting a job, the probability of getting a job in a desired sector. And we also include a couple of questions that we thought were relevant, particularly for the male-female enrollment gap. So one is the probability of getting a job where you can have some work-life balance, and the probability of working in a gender equitable space. The individual characteristics we collect data on in the survey include various dimensions of ability, attitudes towards risk, competition, and self-esteem, and socioeconomic characteristics as well. So trying to get a fix on basically background, family income. The reason we pick these characteristics is that there is a lot of research that shows that men and women differ, particularly on these personality traits. So women are typically more risk averse, less fond of competitive situations, and have lower self-esteem than men. And if these characteristics are also correlated with major choice, in other words, they drive the preference parameters that determine major choice, then that could be a mechanism through which women are selecting out of science and economics. So we fit this model using maximum likelihood. And I'll just show you one table. It's a pretty ugly table, as you can see. But the way to read this table is that any coefficient that is significant here indicates that that particular attribute is important for choice, for major choice for that group of students. And the relative size of the coefficients also tells us something about how important those attributes are. So for example, you can see that log earnings are important for major choice. That's unsurprising, we expect that. But earnings are actually much less important than non-pecuniary characteristics, such as getting high grades, such as enjoying coursework, and even parental approval. The other thing we can see is that log earnings is much more important for men than it is for women. The coefficient is almost twice as high for men as it is for women. And accordingly, the importance of grades and enjoying coursework for women relative to earnings is much, much greater than it is for men. To make a little more sense of these coefficients, what we do is we use these coefficients to back out willingness to pay estimates. And the way to read these WTP estimates is that a willingness to pay of, for example, minus 3.7, which you can see is the first row, first column there. That means students are willing to pay 3.7% of their starting salary to increase the probability that they will get a GPA of above a B+ by 10 percentage points. But notice the difference in the WTP for men and women for that first attribute, for grades. Right? So women are willing to pay more than twice as much as men are of their starting salary in order to be able to increase the probability that they get a higher grade. Similarly, if you look at enjoying coursework, the willingness to pay of women is twice as high again as it is for men. These results are robust to restricting the analysis to just first and second year students. So that is to filter out students who have already chosen their major, which may then in turn influence how they make their decisions. They're also robust to running several different kinds of models as well. So in the first set of models, we code only the choice that students make, or their most preferred choice, as 1, and the rest is all as 0. We also have models where we allow for a full ranking of all the choices. So science first, second option eco, third option social science, whatever it is. And we use all the information in the full ranking to estimate these models. Okay, we also estimate the model, as I said, separately by gender for different characteristics. So how we do this is we basically split the sample into 2, according to the distribution of ability, for example. So we have above median ability students and below median ability.
Did you get stuck for everyone?
Yeah, I thought that was at my end. Hang on, let me just.
We also have interesting results with respect to risk aversion.
Sorry, Professor, you got stuck for everybody at sort of the beginning of the slide.
Sorry,
so
Anahita?
maybe if we could start
Sorry,
from the top. Oh,
sorry,
you got stuck for everybody. Oh, the heterogeneity slide, you got stuck at the top when you started talking about the heterogeneity.
Okay, so I should start with this particular slide again. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, awesome. Right, so we also estimate the model separately by gender, as I said, for each of the following individual characteristics. And we find the way we do this is we split the sample into into 2, above median ability students, below median ability students, above median risk aversion and below median risk aversion. And we re-estimate these models for each of those subsamples, right? And so we find with respect to ability that high ability men and women, relatively high ability men and women in the top half of the distribution, they are quite similar to one another. Low ability men and women, on the other hand, are quite different from one another. So the preference parameter differences are largest among low ability men and women. Similarly for risk averse students put a much higher weight on getting any job at all, and particularly on getting high grades, which they see as a pathway to getting jobs, but they don't put such a high weight on earnings, right? Compared to less risk averse students. And this we think is interesting because remember, as we found in our sample, as indeed a very large literature finds elsewhere, women tend to be more risk averse than men. And so this could potentially be a mechanism for women selecting out of subjects where grades tend to be more variable, such as science and economics, and into subjects where grades can be higher. And so getting a job, even if it's a low paying job, conditional on those grades might be easier. We don't really find any significant differences in terms of the other preference parameters. So those differences are less acute. Okay. Sorry, I'll just get to the questions at the end because I've just got a few more slides left and we can talk about that. The next thing we do is we want to run a decomposition analysis and some counterfactual simulations that allow us to see what share of the gender differences in enrollment can be explained by differences in preference parameters and differences in expectations. And so the way we do this is we swap over the male difference of expectations for the female difference of expectations. So for example, if the male distribution of expectations, if women were to have the same distribution of future beliefs as men do, then what would happen to the gender enrollment gap? And we find that by swapping over those distributions of beliefs, we're able to explain 50 to 75% of the variation in major enrollment. So in other words, that variation drops by 50 to 75% the moment we replace the female distribution with the male distribution. And most of the heavy lifting done here is by 2 particular attributes. One is expected course enjoyment, which causes the gender gap in enrollment to fall by half. And the second is expected grades. So the gender gap in enrollment in economics and in social sciences in particular falls by 20 to 30%. So remember, more women are enrolled in social sciences and more men are enrolled in economics, and that gap goes down by 20 to 30% if women had the same distribution of beliefs as men do. This is much higher than in comparable US studies, where differences in preference parameters tend to explain a larger share of the gap in enrollment. Finally, we go into this in a lot more detail in the paper. I'll be brief here, but we really want to think about where these differences in expectations are coming from. So we are able to benchmark the differences in expectations in our sample in two cases, in the case of grades and in the case of earnings, by using data on cohorts that have already graduated and by using data on cohorts that have got jobs off campus. And so we find that men substantially overestimate their grades in all majors. Women overestimate their grades in social science and humanities, but they underestimate their grades in science, right? So this clearly generates a relative overestimation of grades by men relative to women in science and economics. Similarly, with respect to wages, all students tend to underestimate their average starting salary, except for male science majors. And women are especially pessimistic about the earnings gap with respect to gender. So that could explain, for example, why earnings are relatively less important for them. They just don't expect to earn very much. Could individual characteristics that we talked about earlier, could those be driving these differences in expectations? So for example, students with higher self-esteem might have higher expectations of grades and so on, and we know that's correlated with gender as well. We check to see if that's the case, but we don't find any correlation with individual characteristics in gender. So just to wrap up, these differences in preferences are clearly important, even in our data, but the differences in expectations seem to be even more important. And more importantly, we think they have a bigger role to play in policy because it is possible to shift some of these belief distributions. It's harder to do that with respect to deep-rooted preferences that are rooted in social norms formed from a very young age. Okay, I'm going to stop here and maybe take a few questions, if that's okay.
Okay, so I think Aditi had a few questions. So Aditi, do you just want to go ahead and ask questions? Ask the question.
Yeah. This was great. I'm just so sick of seeing gender gap studies from the US. So it's very nice to see results from India. I had two quick questions. It seems from those questions that you asked in the survey that you showed towards the beginning, that one of the questions is getting at whether the women are underestimating the grades they will get in these subjects. And the other question is getting at whether they just have wrong information about the expected returns from the job. And do you get a sense from your data of which of these two channels dominates? Because the policy response would then be different because one is a shifting beliefs thing and then the other is an information asymmetry thing. So that was the first one. And the last one is maybe out of the scope. I was wondering if you're worried about that this is happening at a college, presumably like liberal arts kind of university where they're picking majors. And in India, because the sorting happens way before, and kids say who wanted to do STEM are probably already, through their entrance exams and already sitting at AIMS and IIT. So are you worried about that selection?
So yeah, those are good questions. So in the first one, I'd say that from what I understood, I think you described both of them as issues of beliefs about future outcomes. So whether it's grades or earnings, both of them relate to beliefs. And so both of them are potentially shiftable, potentially subject to actual evidence with an information treatment, for example. Which is more important? I mean, from our model, the weighting on grades just seems to be higher by students compared to earnings. They just seem to care a lot more about grades than they do about earnings. So I would imagine that shifting grades is more important. Yeah. There's a paper from the US, a very recent one by Conlon, which looks at shifting students' earnings expectations. So basically providing them with some nice graphs that show them what graduating students earn once they've completed degrees in different streams. And he finds that students do actually shift their concentration as a result. So it is possible to do that with earnings. In our setting, if our models hold, grades might have an even larger effect. Yeah. Your second question is really one about external validity, which is an important one. We talk about that a lot in our paper. I think there are two things here. One is that what our setting allows us to do is it allows us to abstract a little bit from issues of feasibility and particularly financial constraints. And so really get at the heart of a preference question as opposed to a constraints question. And so this is a nice setting because
is relatively.
No, but there are scholarships that are given to these kids, right? So that's how we're able to look at socioeconomic characteristics above and below the median. Anyone who cannot fund their way is given money to study. And so that allows us to separate out, in a sense, abstract from the question of financial constraints. If we were to do a similar study in a setting where there are serious financial constraints, then we would find it harder to be able to tell what part of these enrollment issues are coming from finance and what part of them are coming from preferences, and in turn, the impact of financial constraints on those preferences. I would say the same thing applies to the issue about streaming, right? If you have an issue where one is an ability related issue. So we do show that high ability men and women tend to be quite similar. So to the extent that ability routes you through the system into particular streams at an early age, that shouldn't affect the differences in preference parameters that we pick up. And the third issue is a more general one, is that, look, these are preference parameters of kids in liberal arts colleges. How do we know it's the same preferences of girls at a government university? And for that, actually, there's really interesting research that looks at aspirations among lower income girls and boys, men and women. And it finds that despite the fact that many of these students will not go on to study, many of them will never go on to work, their aspirations aren't held back at all. So Seema Jayachandran has a really nice paper where they run an intervention in Haryana schools where they try and increase the aspirations of girls by doing this intervention in middle school, right? And these are government schools, so most of these girls get married between the ages of 18 to 21. But when they ask these girls, where do you see yourself in 10 years? Do you think you'll be working? Do you think you're going to be married? Do you think you'll be able to work after being married, and so on? All of them are replying at the same rates as men and saying, yes, we want to work. And yes, even if we get married, we'll be working, and so on. And we know that the observational data tells us that's not going to be the case. But that doesn't seem to hold back their aspirations. So to that extent, we think these preferences that we get in our very particular setting may well transfer over to preference parameters in different settings, even in settings that are less gender progressive and in settings where financial constraints are more severe. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Aditya had another question that even I was a little curious about. So it was surprising to see that boys care more about parental approval than girls. I think that was something quite interesting. And so it might be interesting to hear a little bit why you think that might be the case. So something here that Aditi says, it could be whether maybe is it because parents pressure sons a bit more to select STEM majors and so on because they're expected to be breadwinners. But so a little bit, maybe a discussion on that might be interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. I think what is going on here is that men face much higher rates of disapproval if they study the humanities or social sciences. So a large part of fixing the gender enrollment gap could actually be reducing male enrollment in science and economics relative to the others. The same story goes for grades, actually, because if you look at the grade estimation, women are quite good at predicting their own grades. It's men who are overestimating their grades in science and economics. And so an information treatment could, instead of leading more women into these disciplines, might actually have the effect of leading men out of those disciplines and into other ones. So that's entirely possible. But in terms of parental approval, that's definitely what's going on. Women can get away with, quote unquote, studying social sciences and humanities because these are seen as more female appropriate subjects. Okay, there's a good question on the role that parents play in shaping beliefs. Yes, of course, that's again very likely to be the case. We are picking up students who are already 18 years old, and their preferences are a combination of the influence from their parents and other social norms and so on and so forth. There's again an interesting paper that looks at exactly this question by Stefan Durkon, which uses the Young Lives data. In fact, Anahita, if I'm not wrong, you did some work on this at some point as well, right? Which looks at basically what share of parental aspirations get passed on to their kids. And they are persistent across generations, but there's still a gap. And in particular, they find that children's aspirations tend to race ahead of those of their parents. And this again fits with what I was just talking about in the context of Haryana, which is that even though these girls come from settings where their aspiration probably not allowed to grow, that doesn't seem to hold them back in terms of what they want to achieve for themselves in terms of education and labor market outcomes. Okay, and I think we discussed these questions right at the end. Okay, great. So maybe I should press on to the next paper. I'm going to be a little bit quicker because we are kind of halfway through this session already. This is a paper on gender and education as it relates to sex selection. So the paper is called Unwanted Daughters, the impact of a ban on sex selection on the educational attainment of women. And I wrote this with a former student of mine. And in this paper, the context for it is really thinking about the issue of missing women, which, as I'm sure all of you know, is the empirically observed phenomenon of very skewed male-female sex ratios in highly patriarchal societies, with large amounts of gender discrimination, which arise out of sex-selective abortions, which means that many girls don't get born in the first place, and gross neglect and discrimination, which leads to lower health investments and higher rates of female mortality, especially again at a very young age. So in response to at least the first part of those problems, many countries have implemented laws that ban sex selective abortion. So for example, the two largest countries in the world both have laws banning, in the case of India, banning even sex screening techniques. So if you try and get an ultrasound done, you have to sign this form that says that the doctor hasn't disclosed the gender of the sex of the baby to you, and then you haven't asked, and so on and so forth. China has a similar law as well. But in the presence of deep-rooted son preference and gender discrimination, this kind of law can lead to some unintended welfare consequences. So on the one hand, it may lead to higher rates of female births, but it might simply displace prenatal discrimination into postnatal discrimination. And this can happen through several mechanisms, as I'll just discuss. But before that, the research question that we want to set out to answer in this paper is, what is the impact of a ban on sex-selective abortions on education investments, in particular in surviving girls? What we do is we exploit the staggered implementation of a law, the PNDT Act, for those of you who've heard of it, which bans sex screening via ultrasound across Indian states to identify the relative impact on the education of girls compared to boys. Okay, there are several mechanisms through which we think this might be true. Right, the first is that such an act could lead to an impact on fertility. So the fertility stopping rule, for example, is where, in the absence of external assistance in managing the gender composition of your children, parents often keep having children until they get their desired composition. So you'll see the phenomenon in India of many families having either one son or a girl and a boy, or two girls and a boy, or three girls and a boy, with the boy being the youngest child. That's just an implementation of the fertility stopping rule. You keep having children, you keep trying again and again till you get your desired sex composition. And so one impact of passing such an act could be that people simply start to have larger families, and that means more intense competition for resources among siblings, which could lead to effects on both boys and girls and could disproportionately hurt girls. The second mechanism that we look at is to investigate selection versus behavior change explanations. So over here, if we think that certain kinds of families are more likely to practice sex discrimination, then this kind of ban is going to hit them more. So for example, it could be the case that wealthier families are more likely to practice these forms of discrimination because they tend to have more money at stake or more wealth at stake when they have daughters as opposed to sons. And so if after the passing of this act, you see more girls being born into richer families, then just mechanically education levels of girls should rise relative to boys. That's a selection effect. But there's also a behavior change effect, which is the unwantedness of girls. So earlier, you would only have daughters if you really wanted to have daughters, and now you have all these daughters which you have because you weren't able to prevent it, and so you just naturally change your behavior towards the daughters that are born. And finally, we also consider marriage market effects as a result of these changes, right? And this has been highlighted quite a bit in recent years, that this changing sex ratio, particularly in states like Haryana, Punjab, and other North Indian states, has led to a marriage squeeze, where there are very few women now for the number of men. An act like this has the potential of reversing the marriage squeeze, so increasing the number of women relative to the number of men. And that in turn could affect how parents of girls choose to invest in their education, because education is often used to raise the returns to marriage in the marriage market. So to match with a better groom, for example, parents will invest in education. So we look at all of these different mechanisms in this paper. Again, a quick preview of results. We find that the ban led to an increase in the probability of births of girls in families with firstborn girls by 2.5 percentage points. So the ban was effective in increasing the births of girls. Why do we look at firstborn girls? So this is pre-existing literature, paper by Bhalhotra and Cochrane, finds that sex discrimination isn't very common among firstborn children. But in families where the firstborn is a girl, there's suddenly a spike in the usage of sex screening and so on for the second-born child. So the firstborn girl or the sex of the firstborn child provides quasi-exogenous variation in the likelihood that a family is then going to go out and seek sex-selective abortions. And so parents, empirically, it's been found that parents tend not to do this for their firstborn, but depending on whether they have a boy or a girl, they will do it for their secondborn. So that, in a sense, is another level of treatment, right? Treated families are families where the firstborn is already a girl. The flip side of that first positive effect of higher births of girls is that the surviving girls' education levels are going down relative to boys. So they're less likely to complete grade 10, grade 12, and enter university. These impacts we find are concentrated among less wealthy households, not more wealthy households. And we interpret this as evidence of liquidity constraints. So the wealthier households are probably able to circumvent the ban by accessing, backdoor operations, private sector, unscrupulous providers of ultrasounds and of abortion facilities. We don't find any increase in total fertility. So this isn't an effect of sibling competition because families are becoming larger. And we do find some evidence that there could be marriage market effects going on in the background, because we find that girls are more likely to marry later if they were born in states that were treated with this act. Okay, so there's very little research on the impact of sex-selective abortions, particularly on education. There's a very nice paper which just recently got published by Anukriti, which looks at kind of the reverse effect, which is the impact of the diffusion of USG technology in the 80s and the 90s on health investments in girls. And they find the reverse effect. So the diffusion of the technology led to decreasing births of girls and better health outcomes for the girls that were born, or the surviving girls. So in a sense, we look at the reverse impact, because in our paper, the variation is coming from a law that prevents sex-selective abortions. And the outcome we look at is education, not health investments. We also provide evidence on the impacts of the PNDT. This has been done before in a slightly different data setting to ours, and we think ours is more robust. It uses a much larger data set, much more granular. And as I said, it uses the quasi-exogenous variation that I just talked about earlier in the sex of the firstborn child. And finally, and I think this is the most interesting finding, it really emphasizes the unintended welfare consequences of undertaking regulatory action in a very strongly patriarchal environment without thinking about displacement effects of that. So in a similar vein, there's another paper that looks at the amendment of the Hindu Inheritance Act, which sought to impose gender equality by empowering women, and actually led to worsening gender outcomes on several dimensions for women, because parents, in anticipation of the act, started changing their behavior towards their daughters. Similarly, conditional cash transfers that were promoting the births of girls, as well as trying to encourage lower fertility, ended up backfiring spectacularly in Haryana, because they led to the increase in the number of single child families where the single child's sex was male. Okay, so by way of background, again, I'm sure this is familiar to most of you. Sex detection techniques were first introduced in 1971. They spread through the country rapidly, leading to a large number of abortions. The female-male child sex ratio fell from 964 to 911 between 1971 and 2011 for every 1,000 boys. It's improved a little bit since, I should say, but certainly in the time frame that we are considering for the study, this was a period of unambiguous decline in average. So in response to all of this, a national level PNDT Act was imposed in 1996, But there was some geographic variation in the imposition of the act. So Maharashtra had implemented its own ban in 1989, and Jammu and Kashmir was excluded from the national ban until 2002. So this sets up a natural experiment for us where we are able to use both Maharashtra and Jammu and Kashmir as control states, in the sense that neither of them experienced any changes through the period 89 to 2002. And all of the other states are the treated states, because in 96, all of them got treated with this ban. Okay, I have been through the theoretical motivation, so maybe what I'm going to do is just skip this slide. I'll talk more about it when I get to the mechanisms. The data is from the 4th round of the National Family Health Survey, so very large number of households that are covered, 600,000. It collects a full fertility history of all women between the ages of 15 to 49. So we're able to construct a panel of all births between 1989 and 2002. And it also has the educational attainment of all individuals who are listed in the household roster as of the 4th round, which was conducted in 2015 and 2016. That's the estimating equation that we run. Again, the only thing you need to remember is that there are 3 sources of variation. One is whether the household was in a treated state during this period, whether the household or the child was born after the imposition of the ban in these treated states, and whether the family had a firstborn girl, which, as I explained before, is going to provide the variation. So this is the strategy, I should say, for identifying the impact of the ban on female births. We also do the same thing now for education investments, where we also use 3 sources of variation, but these are different. These are treat, post, and female. So this is to back out the male-female differential in investments in education. The reason we don't use firstborn girl in our main estimating equation here, we do bring it in later, is because the women who are already married in our sample have left their original household and moved into their marital household. And unfortunately, we can't trace them back to their original families and figure out whether they were born in a firstborn girl or not. We don't know who their siblings are from the data. We do know that for a subset of women who aren't married. And so we run that as a kind of a mechanism check later in the paper. I should also point out we have a full set of fixed effects, which you may have noticed earlier, which includes pairwise interactions of all of the individual fixed effects. We have a triple difference estimator, and we have pairwise interactions of all combinations of the effects that make up the triple difference. So this allows for a very flexible specification that allows us to control for time trends and state trends interacted with female and with firstborn girl, and so on and so forth. We also have a relatively small number of untreated states in this case, so 2 untreated states and 34 treated states. So we want to be able to bootstrap our standard errors to account for that. Okay, so this is the first set of results, right? This is the impact on female births and the probability of female births. And as you can see, there's an increase in the probability of female births in households where the firstborn child was a female, right, in the treated states after the implementation of the act. And this effect is between 2.5 and 2.6 percentage points increase in probability, which is sizable. The only time those effects drop out is when we include mother fixed effects, right? So these changes aren't taking place within individual families, but they're taking place at the extensive margin. So some families are just having more girls rather than within the same family, a mother changing her mind about whether to have another child or not. The second set of results relate to education. Again, I'll just show you this one table and summarize the rest of the results later. We run these results, as you can see, for all states and for border states for an alternative counterfactual group, if you will, if we think that bordering states are relatively more comparable to one another. But again, the story is kind of consistent throughout. We see a decline in female educational attainment relative to male educational attainment in treated states after the implementation of the act. So between 2.2 and 2.3 percentage points less likely to complete grade 10, 3.4 to 3.5 percentage points less likely to complete 12, and 3.1 to 3.2 percentage points less likely to enter university. These effects are amplified, and in fact, they're driven by the impacts in the less wealthy households. So households that are in the bottom 60% of the wealth distribution, these effects are much larger there. So you can see it's 4.1 to 4.3 percentage points more likely to see a female birth in non-wealthy households. And the gap in educational attainment is also higher in those households. And as I said earlier, we interpret this as evidence of the presence of liquidity constraints, which more wealthy households are able to evade. We do a bunch of robustness checks. We drop Maharashtra and Jammu and Kashmir respectively one by one. We use bordering states. We don't find any evidence of differential pre-trends in the triple difference estimate. In fact, I have a picture of that right here. So these are the pre-trends in that main estimate, the main beta that we're estimating between 90 and 95. And hopefully you'll agree that these are basically quite flat before the actual law came in 1996. We also check to see whether there are some fundamental changes in son preference taking place on account of the ban. And this is based on women being asked what their ideal number of children were. And there's no evidence that there's any difference across these states by this dimension. Okay, so what are the mechanisms?
Sorry, we have one quick clarificatory question. Do the results differ by rural and urban areas? Is there a sense of?
I'll talk about that in just a minute. Yeah, so that's one of the mechanisms we do discuss. So one is that the effects, as I said, the main differentiator is wealth. So effects are driven by increased births in non-wealthy households. This is a selection effect because if you're born into a non-wealthy household, you're more likely to be born into a non-wealthy household, you're more likely to have lower levels of education. So mechanically, girls' education is going to go down on average because there are now more girls in non-wealthy households. But even within those non-wealthy households, if we just limit the sample to non-wealthy households, we are seeing an increase in discrimination. So a widening of the gender education gap. So there's also a treatment effect or a behavioral effect, if you will. So we find evidence of both. To answer your question, the impacts are much higher in rural compared to urban areas. We interpret this as being on account of, again, limited accessibility to alternatives. So this is even after controlling for wealth. There may just be fewer options to those private sector alternatives in rural areas compared to urban areas. People in rural areas rely on the state much more. And so it is presumably much harder to be able to circumvent this ban in a government clinic than it is in a private sector operator. We don't find evidence of higher fertility after the ban. We do find evidence that the gender discrimination worsens at higher birth orders. There are many reasons why this could be the case. In general, research finds that birth order is an important mediator in terms of the investments that children get, with higher birth order children receiving higher levels of investments. And higher birth order boys in particular, eldest sons in particular, receiving the dominant share of resources in a household, even relative to later born boys. So we find that this male-female gap increases at higher birth orders. So it becomes worse and worse as people have more children. The presence of more sisters also worsens the gender gap. So in general, the presence of sisters tends to be good for children, right? Because if you think of boys as basically resource extractors, because resources get concentrated in them, having more boys in a family pulls resources away from other siblings. Having more girls in a family gives more resources to other children. But that effect of having more girls is better for men than it is for women, right? So boys benefit more from having sisters, girls benefit less from having sisters. And finally, as I said earlier, we can only do this for half the sample, but we do find that the primary school effects are larger in the firstborn girl households. Remember, these are the households that were more likely to seek out sex-selective abortions to begin with. And so these are, in a sense, the households that are facing the brunt of the treatment effect. We also find some interesting marriage market effects. So clearly there is a marriage market angle here as well. So what would we expect if there are more women being born relative to men in terms of the sex ratio? We would expect that women will have to wait for longer before they can match with suitable men, right? So we expect that women are less likely to get married early, and that is in fact what we see. In treated states, women marry later. These effects are significant at both the ages of 15 and 18, though the effect is larger at the age of 15. And the age of marriage for girls also increases significantly. Yes, there's a typo there, but that's the age of marriage for women increases significantly by about half a year. Another impact that you could expect to see is where the spousal age gap goes down. This is because when you have a very skewed sex ratio, there tend to be a larger number of older men who are unmarried. And so that leads to larger age gaps, spousal age gaps between men and women, And so a ban that reverses this decline in the sex ratio would presumably reduce that. The coefficient's the right sign, but unfortunately it's not significant, so we can't read too much into it. But it does seem that there are some marriage market effects going on here. And so the way we'd interpret that is to say that the net effect that we're finding on education incorporates the fact that families may be spending more money on educating their girls because they anticipate a greater difficulty in getting them married down the line. Okay, I'm going to conclude here and just briefly refer to a piece of work I'm doing again with Aparajita, which looks at health outcomes of the PNDT. And we find that PNDT also led to increasing gender gaps in infant mortality. Again, similar reasoning as in this case, just the greater birth of unwanted girls. But in contrast, we find that the early effects of the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaign appear to be relatively promising. And this is distinguished from the PNDT because it's not just a regulatory action, right? It has a big regulatory component to it. So they're cracking down on clinics, filing FIRs and so on. But it also has, as we all know, this kind of big aspirational component to it, which gets in celebrities and politicians and so on to talk about the benefits of daughters being born. And so this could be an interesting contrast as a policy that tries to target not just the immediate cause of sex selection or skewed sex ratios, but also some of the deeper underlying drivers. So yeah, there's no magic bullet to deliver gender equality. We must think through some of these unintended consequences. This is not to make the case for not having a PNDT, by the way. Obviously, there are benefits to it just because of the greater number of girls being born. But we have to consider these unintended welfare consequences as well to get a fuller sense of the impact of the policy. Okay, I'm going to stop here and take some questions. So let me stop sharing my slides as well.
So we don't have any questions in the chat box other than the one I already asked about this paper in particular, but we have a few. Oh, wait, okay, okay. So we don't. So we can maybe move into talking a little bit about the plans for the center for CEDA, or there's a few questions that we had previously that I thought might be interesting to discuss as well, but maybe we can spend a couple of minutes talking about the new Gender Hub and then move into those.
Yeah, I will be very quick because I don't want to take up all of your time. So the Center for Economic Data Analysis is a center we have set up at Ashoka University. So this is under the leadership of Professor Ashwini Deshpande. I'm sure many of you have heard of her. She does a lot of work in development and labor with a specific focus on caste and gender as well. And the aim for the center is to basically become a hub for socioeconomic data. And the motivation for setting it up really was that we thought that particularly amongst civil society actors, we just see a kind of a lack of engagement with data and a lack of engagement with publicly available, widely available data like census data, NSS data, National Family Health Survey data, and so on, which can lead to a lot of fake news being spread around, a lot of low quality journalism, and a lot of poor policy making. And so what this site intends to be is, on the one hand, provide easy access to these data sets, and not just the unit level data like researchers tend to use, because that we can already get access to, but that allows people to visualize what these indicators look like mapped out against each other, and basically work towards building a civil society that's just more conversant with the use of data and with the use of evidence to explore hypotheses and to at least check out their hypotheses, provide some exploratory information on their hypotheses. So that's the main aim. The site's hopefully going to be up and running in about a month or so. And we're starting, as I said, with very large publicly available data sets. We're going to run a blog side by side with this. And we're really looking for contributors to the blog. So basically, we're looking for posts about any issue that relates to socioeconomic issues in India, and that can be told particularly through a data story as something that's easy to understand. it could be something like fertility rates by community. These are just such big political emotive issues, and nobody seems to ever use the data to tell them, unless you look it up in some journal or something, which no one does. Or it could be something about male female gender gaps and so on. So that's what CEDA is designed to do. But we also want to move beyond that to become a hub for gender related research. This is more ambitious. So this is something we're fundraising for right now. We want to be able to basically collect larger data sets in order to inform policy more directly. I mean, just to give you an example of some of the issues where we think we just don't have enough data right now from anywhere. Everyone's researching labor supply and why women's labor supply is so low. But we know so little about the other side of the picture, which is labor demand. Where is demand for women's work coming from? Is there discrimination? Are there particular characteristics that workers are looking for that women are not able to fulfill, or characteristics of those jobs that women are just not willing to work in? What do female-run enterprises look like? What does recruitment in white-collar jobs for men and women look like? We just have very little information on the demand side. So this is an example of the kind of data we would eventually like to collect. And when I say we want to be a hub, it means that we necessarily, CEDA may not necessarily have the bandwidth to go out and collect all of this data themselves, but we would love to be able to fund individual researchers and organizations that are seeking to help put together these kinds of data sets that can better inform policy, especially with respect to gender. So those are our very ambitious plans with CEDA, but we're confident that we should be able to certainly have the site up in about a month and hopefully get some way towards our gender hub ambitions in about a year.
That all sounds very promising and interesting. We're kind of out of time, but I'll just wrap up with two quick questions. One, there was some interest in our group from understanding how to go about individual research work. So a lot of people are towards the end of undergrad or just starting masters or even between masters and potentially a PhD. So just how to think through your individual research ideas and go about actually, converting them into research projects and potentially papers and otherwise. So it might be interesting to hear from you some suggestions for doing that. And then one question we ask all of our speakers almost to leave us with is book recommendations. So what are your top 3 book recommendations for the group? So we'll wrap with that.
Okay, the first one, I would say that kind of an easy way to get research experience is to try and get a research assistant job somewhere, or either working with an academic or working with an organization that does research. The reason I say that's easier is it's hard to come up with ideas by yourself, especially straight out of undergrad, put the data together, be in an environment where you can bounce ideas off people and get other people to refine your ideas. This is all very hard to do. So I think trying to get opportunities that is also hard to do. It's hard to come by opportunities, but if you can get hold of a research assistant opportunity, work with someone who is a full-time researcher, that's really useful because it becomes a very sharp learning curve for you after that. The second thing, in terms of generating ideas, honestly, there's nothing that helps more than just reading widely, whether that's reading, latest journal articles, whether that's reading, the World Bank has a couple of very nice development impact blogs, or reading other blogs or academics, just seeing what new research looks like. That's the best way to generate new ideas of your own, even though executing them, as I said, in isolation can be hard. And the counterpart to all of this, at least for applied research, is that you have to build your skills early, because you will hit a wall in terms of what you can do quantitatively very quickly unless you're able to catch up on those data analysis skills. So that's also really important. Again, jobs can help with that. So getting an RA-ship and so on, that can be really useful in terms of helping with that. But otherwise, this is also something you can do by yourself, right? Because there are lots of courses available now online that can help you get better at Stata, get better at R, and so on and so forth. And these skills are really, really valuable, I would say, not just for economists, but more broadly in the social sciences and data sciences in general. So that's important. Book recommendations. I wish you told me this earlier instead of asking. I always struggle to come up with something on the spot. I can tell you what I'm currently reading. I'm currently reading Range which is actually super interesting. I didn't think that this would be the kind of book that I would find exciting, but the amount of academic potential that it has, and the number of ideas that it's brimming with, is just extraordinary. It came out, I think, last year, but there's a new edition out right now, and thankfully it's available in India. So I think so far it's been very exciting, and I would highly recommend that to all of you. What else have I read recently from economics? I don't have a genre recommendation, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm going to leave you with Range for now. That's what I can think of off the top of my head. So I think that would be hopefully an exciting read. Mind you, I've only read about a third of it, so let's hope it keeps the good work up. But I think it will. It's just written really well. Yeah. So I should stop here. If there are any other quick questions, I can take them. Okay, that sounds good. Thank you so much for inviting me again.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. That was a really interesting session. And I mean, to all of our participants, if you haven't already, please do read the papers as well. They're really cool. And we're so happy that all of you joined us on a Sunday evening. And even as lockdowns are easing and there are options outside of the house. And stay tuned for more activities that we do. Sign up for our group, follow us on Twitter, and check out our website for all of those stuff. I sound like a YouTube influencer, but yeah, thank you so much.
But you guys are doing a great job on social media, so clearly it's working. Good luck with the networks, and I will definitely look out for more of your events going forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.